A king can lose a throne in battle. He can lose it to rebellion. He can lose it to a rival with sharper knives and better timing. But George III lost something stranger. He remained alive. He remained crowned. His name still carried the authority of Britain, empire, parliament, law, and God's anointed monarchy. And yet, somewhere behind his own eyes, the king seemed to vanish. Servants heard the restless talking. Ministers watched for signs. Physicians argued over his body as if the future of the nation were hidden in his pulse. And across Britain, one terrifying question began to spread. What happens when the sovereign is present, but unreachable? To understand that fear, we have to step carefully into a world where monarchy was not just ceremony. It was a living symbol of order. The king's mind was not treated as a private chamber. It was part of the machinery of state. So when George III began to unravel, the crisis was never only medical. It was constitutional. It was political. It was intimate. And it was deeply human. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. This is not a story about a mad king in the simple, mocking way history sometimes remembers him. That version is too easy. It turns suffering into a costume and uncertainty into gossip. The deeper story is more troubling. George III was a man who tried to make kingship moral, disciplined, almost sacred. He believed in duty. He believed in self-command. He believed a monarch should stand as an example to a restless nation, which is why his collapse frightened people so profoundly. It suggested that even the highest office in the kingdom could be undone by the private fragility of a single mind. Chapter 2. A crown inherited too young. George III was not born expecting to become the king whose mind would one day unsettle a nation. He entered the world in 1738, a royal child inside a family already marked by distance, discipline, and political discomfort. His grandfather, George II, sat on the throne. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, waited impatiently in the line of succession, a position that often breeds resentment even in ordinary families. And royal families have never been famous for handling resentment with grace. Then Frederick died in 1751. George was 12 years old. That single death changed the shape of his life. A boy who had been near the crown was suddenly placed directly beneath it. He became heir apparent, no longer just another prince moving through tutors, prayers, lessons, and court expectations, but the future embodiment of Britain itself. It is difficult to overstate what that meant in the 18th century. A modern public figure can divide work from self, at least in theory. A Georgian king could not. His body, his marriage, his habits, his friendships, even his moods could become political material. People did not merely ask whether he was competent. They asked what kind of moral climate his reign would create. And young George was raised to answer that question with seriousness. His mother, Augusta, Princess of Wales, and his tutor, Lord Bute, helped shape in him a powerful idea of kingship. The crown, they suggested, should not be swallowed by factions. It should not drift helplessly among ambitious ministers. It should stand above party, above corruption, above the loose manners and cynical bargaining that many associated with the previous reigns. Whether this was noble, naive, or dangerous depends on where one stands. To George, it seems to have felt like a calling. He grew into a young man who wanted to restore dignity to monarchy. Not glamour, exactly. Not wild magnificence. Dignity. Order. Moral gravity. There was a personal edge to this ambition. His own dynasty, the Hanoverians, had not always been loved with warmth. George I had arrived from Hanover speaking limited English, and George II had remained, in many minds, still partly foreign. The monarchy had survived, certainly. It had become embedded in British political life. But survival is not the same as affection. George III understood that he could be different. He was born in Britain. He spoke English as his first language. He presented himself not as a distant German prince wearing a British crown, but as a native king. That mattered. It gave him an opportunity his predecessors had not fully possessed, to seem personally bound to the nation he ruled. When he came to the throne in 1760, he was only 22. At that age, many people are still learning the boundaries of their own character. George inherited not only palaces and ceremonies, but war, debt, empire, faction, expectation, and a political system that had spent decades learning how to limit royal power while still speaking reverently of royal authority. His accession was greeted with hope, partly because youth often allows a country to imagine renewal. The new king appeared clean where politics seemed dirty, earnest where ministers seemed calculating, stable where the court had often seemed tangled in private rivalries and public suspicion. But hope can be a dangerous gift to place on a young man. George did not merely inherit a crown. He inherited a debate about what the crown was for. Was the monarch supposed to guide government actively? Was he meant to choose ministers according to his own judgment? Could he resist political factions without becoming a faction himself? Could he restore royal authority without alarming those who feared absolutism? These were not decorative questions. They sat at the center of British constitutional life. George's tragedy, in one sense, began long before any visible illness. It began with an impossible expectation that a young king could be both symbol and strategist, moral example and political operator, national father and partisan target. He wanted to be a virtuous monarch in an age that had grown suspicious of virtue when it came dressed in power. And so, from the beginning, there was a tension inside his reign. The more sincerely George believed in duty, the more personally he felt the failures of government. The more he tried to lift the crown above corruption, the more deeply he became entangled in the ordinary grime of politics. This is the first key to understanding why his later collapse frightened Britain so much. The country did not see a careless ruler finally undone by indulgence. It saw a king who had tried to discipline himself, to master his household, his conscience, and his office. A king who believed that control was not merely useful, but sacred. And that made the possibility of losing control almost unbearable. Chapter 3. The King Who Wanted to be Virtuous. Before George III became a medical mystery, before physicians studied his urine, his pulse, his sleep, his speech, and his silences, he was known for something far less theatrical. He was known for being serious, not brilliant in the glittering way some courtiers admired, not dangerously charming, not a prince of salons, scandals, and whispered affairs. George's personality did not lend itself easily to legend, at least not the flattering kind. He could be stubborn. He could be formal. He could seem narrow in imagination. But beneath those limitations was a quality even many critics had to take seriously. He believed in the moral weight of his office. For George, kingship was not a costume worn over private appetite. It was a duty that reached into the details of life. He rose early. He worked steadily. He took religion seriously. He valued marriage and family in a courtly world where fidelity was often treated as admirable in theory and inconvenient in practice. His household was meant to project order, and that order mattered because the king believed the private life of a monarch had public meaning. There is a temptation, from a modern distance, to smile at this. A king believing himself virtuous can sound like the beginning of hypocrisy. And sometimes, in politics, virtue becomes a language people use to defend their own will. George was not free from that danger. His conviction that he acted from duty could harden into inflexibility. When a man believes he is defending moral order, compromise may begin to look like surrender. A more relaxed ruler might have laughed off opposition, bargained more easily, or accepted the untidy give and take of parliamentary life. George often wanted politics to make moral sense, and politics rarely offers that courtesy. But it would be too simple to reduce his seriousness to self-righteousness. Those close to him saw a man of habit, devotion, and conscience. His marriage to Queen Charlotte became, by royal standards, notably domestic. Their large family gave the monarchy an image of respectable continuity. The king, who had inherited suspicion around the Hanoverian line, now presented himself as stable, British, Protestant, sober, and paternal. This image was not accidental. It answered a hunger in the nation. 18th century Britain was expanding, arguing, trading, borrowing, fighting, and changing. Wealth was being made at unsettling speed. Political pamphlets tore reputations apart with enthusiasm. London could feel both magnificent and morally exhausted. In that setting, George's personal discipline became part of his appeal. He seemed to offer a center, not a romantic center, not a dazzling one, but a center that got up in the morning, said its prayers, read its papers, loved its children, and believed that duty still meant something. That is why the later illness cut so deeply into the public imagination. The collapse of a visibly reckless king might have confirmed what people already suspected about power. The collapse of George III disturbed a different assumption. It suggested that discipline did not guarantee safety. Piety did not shield the mind. A life built around order could still open without warning into terror. And there is another contradiction here, quieter but important. The very qualities that made George seem steady may have made his suffering harder to interpret. A man who is expected to represent control does not easily become a patient. He becomes a problem. His agitation is not merely agitation. It is a constitutional signal. His sleeplessness is not merely sleeplessness. It becomes a question for ministers. His speech, once the ordinary speech of a diligent ruler, becomes evidence to be weighed, reported, feared. In a private household, illness changes the rhythm of rooms. In a palace, it changes the rhythm of government. So when George began to speak too rapidly, to grow restless, to become difficult to calm, those around him were not simply worried for a husband, a father, or a man in distress. They were watching the symbolic body of the state behave unpredictably. This is what makes George's story more than a royal medical case. The tragedy lies in the collision between the man he tried to be and the vulnerability he could not command. He had built his identity around self-mastery. He believed the king should be a guardian of moral order. Yet the illness that would come to define him attacked precisely that image. It did not merely weaken him, it made him appear unreachable to those who needed him most. And perhaps that is why the memory of George III remains so uneasy. He was not frightening because he was monstrous. He was frightening because he was human, in a position designed to look almost more than human. The crown could be polished. The household could be regulated. The prayers could be said. The papers could be read, but behind the eyes of the king, there was still a mind no ceremony could fully protect. Chapter 4. Empire, Parliament, and the Pressure of Rule. To see George III clearly, we have to place him inside the machine that surrounded him. Not the gilded machine of coaches, uniforms, levees, and court ceremony, though that mattered. The more dangerous machine was political. Parliament, ministers, factions, newspapers, debts, war, patronage, empire, and the constant question of where royal influence ended and national government began. Britain in George's reign was not a quiet kingdom ruled by a king's simple command. It was a restless constitutional monarchy, proud of having limited arbitrary power, yet still built around reverence for the crown. That balance was delicate. Everyone spoke of loyalty. Everyone claimed to defend the Constitution. And almost everyone, given the opportunity, tried to bend the system toward their own advantage. George inherited this world believing the crown should recover some of its moral and political force. He did not imagine himself as a decorative monarch. He wanted to choose ministers he trusted, resist the dominance of powerful aristocratic factions, and prevent government from becoming the private property of men who treated office like inheritance. On paper, that ambition could sound almost reforming. In practice, it made enemies. The political world around him was full of shifting alliances, personal rivalries, and families whose influence had been built over generations. A king who tried to stand above faction could very quickly appear to be building a faction of his own. A monarch who spoke of independence could be accused of manipulation. The language of virtue, once it entered Parliament, became ammunition. This was the atmosphere in which George ruled, a place where every appointment could be read as a signal, every dismissal as a conspiracy, every royal preference as evidence of hidden design. The early years of his reign were marked by ministerial instability. Governments rose and fell. Coalitions formed, cracked, and reformed. Some politicians saw George as a necessary source of authority. Others feared that he was trying to revive a dangerous kind of personal monarchy. The king's supporters might call it restoring balance. His critics might call it influence, intrigue, or worse. The truth sits somewhere less tidy. George III was neither an absolute ruler in disguise, nor a powerless ornament. He operated within a constitution still being tested in real time. The British system had not yet settled into the later pattern in which the monarch's political role became mostly ceremonial. The king still had influence, and George intended to use it. This matters because his illness did not strike a purely symbolic figure. It struck someone still woven into the practice of government. When a modern ceremonial monarch becomes ill, the machinery of state can usually continue with only limited disruption. But in George's Britain, the sovereign's judgment still mattered in ministerial choice, legislation, patronage, diplomacy, and the moral theater of public authority. His signature, his approval, his confidence, and his presence were not empty rituals. They were part of how power moved. And beyond Parliament, the empire was expanding into something vast, profitable, and unstable. Britain's victories and possessions brought wealth and pride, but also administrative strain, military cost, and moral contradiction. The empire was not a single clear project directed neatly from the throne. It was a sprawling web of colonies, trade interests, armies, charters, governors, merchants, and local crises that could erupt far from London and still shake politics at home. A king who wanted order faced a world multiplying disorder faster than any palace routine could contain. Here, George's personality becomes especially important. He believed in duty, but duty did not simplify the choices before him. It may even have made them heavier. A careless ruler can shrug at contradiction. A conscientious one has to live with it. The pressure of rule was not simply that George had too much to do. It was that every major issue seemed to test the meaning of monarchy itself. If he intervened, he was overreaching. If he held back, he was weak. If he trusted ministers, he risked becoming their prisoner. If he resisted them, he looked like a schemer. If he presented himself as virtuous, critics searched eagerly for proof of hypocrisy. And because politics in this period was intensely personal, public pressure did not remain abstract. It gathered around names, faces, friendships, family relationships, and rumors. George was not governing a calm bureaucracy. He was navigating a world of men who wrote letters, traded insults, managed loyalties, and understood that reputation could be as useful as law. This does not mean that politics caused his illness. That would be too neat, and the evidence does not allow it. But politics shaped the meaning of his illness. It explains why later signs of disorder carried such explosive force. A king's sleeplessness mattered more when ministers needed decisions. His agitation mattered more when factions were already waiting to interpret weakness. His inability to govern, even temporarily, mattered more because there was no simple, universally accepted answer to what should happen next. The crown was not only a jewel resting safely above the storm, it was one of the instruments by which the storm was managed. And George had spent years insisting that the person wearing it still mattered. That insistence gave his reign energy. It gave his kingship purpose. It also made his vulnerability dangerous. For if the king was meant to be an active guardian of order, then the failure of his mind was not merely sad. It threatened to expose how much of the Constitution still depended on a human being who could tremble, rage, forget, recover, and break. Chapter 5. The American Wound. There are defeats that end when the treaty is signed, and then there are defeats that continue living inside a reign. For George III, the American Revolution became more than a military and political disaster. It became a wound in the meaning of his kingship. He had wanted to be a monarch of duty, order, and restored authority. Instead, one of the defining events of his reign was the loss of a vast part of Britain's Atlantic empire. The colonies did not slip away quietly. They rebelled in the language of rights, liberty, representation, and resistance to tyranny. To the king's critics, especially across the Atlantic, George became a convenient symbol of oppression. In pamphlets and declarations, a complicated imperial crisis could be given a face. That face was his. This was one of the cruel efficiencies of political conflict. The causes of the American Revolution were not the work of one man's temper. They involved parliament, taxation, imperial debt, colonial assemblies, trade restrictions, military enforcement, local grievances, and a long argument over sovereignty. But revolutions often need a single figure to stand for everything resented. George III, by title and symbolism, was available. The king himself did not see the crisis as a romantic birth of liberty. He saw rebellion. He saw subjects rejecting lawful authority. He saw the empire, already expensive and difficult to govern, threatened by defiance that might spread if answered weakly. In his mind, firmness was not cruelty. It was duty. That distinction matters. Modern memory often places George in the role of villain because the American founding story required one. But from London, the question looked different. If Parliament had authority over the empire, could colonial resistance simply be tolerated? If one group of subjects rejected imperial law, what did that mean for the others? If the crown yielded, was it prudence or the beginning of imperial collapse? George's tragedy was that his strongest instincts led him toward the hardest line. He valued obedience, hierarchy, and constitutional order. The Americans framed their resistance as defense against arbitrary power. George framed it as a refusal of legitimate authority. Both sides spoke the language of principle. Both sides believed surrender would corrupt the future. War turned this argument into blood, expense, and humiliation. As the conflict dragged on, Britain faced not only colonial resistance but widening international pressure. France entered the war. Spain followed. What had begun as an imperial rebellion became part of a larger struggle among European powers. The longer it continued, the more the king's confidence appeared stubborn rather than steady. There is a particular kind of political damage that comes from persistence after success has become unlikely. At first, determination can look admirable. Later, the same determination begins to resemble blindness. George was not blind to difficulty, but he was deeply reluctant to accept the independence of the colonies. To him, the loss was not merely strategic. It was moral and constitutional. It meant the empire had failed to hold together under lawful authority. It meant that resistance had been rewarded. It meant that the crown, which he had tried to make a center of unity, had become associated with rupture. When Britain effectively lost the war, the impact at home was severe. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 did not instantly end every formal matter, but it made the direction of events painfully clear. Lord North's government, long associated with the conduct of the war, could not survive forever under the weight of failure. Opposition voices grew louder. The king's judgment was questioned. His influence over ministers became more controversial. The old fear returned in a sharper form. Had George's idea of active kingship led the nation into disaster? This is where the American wound connects to the later story of his illness. It is not that the war drove him mad. That would be melodrama pretending to be explanation. Human minds and bodies do not usually break for one clean historical reason, and George's later condition remains medically disputed. But the war changed the emotional and political weather around him. It weakened the aura of command. It gave his opponents a powerful example of royal misjudgment. It made the crown seem less like a source of calm and more like an institution capable of error on an imperial scale. For a king who believed so intensely in duty, that failure could not have been light. And yet, George did not disappear after America. This is easy to forget. The loss of the colonies did not end his reign. It did not even end Britain's imperial ambitions. In some ways, Britain's global power would continue expanding elsewhere. The monarchy survived. The government adapted. The country absorbed defeat with the bruised practicality that empires often show when they cannot afford to mourn too long. But for George personally, the symbolism remained. A king who had wanted to restore authority had presided over rebellion. A monarch who cherished order had watched a political community tear itself away. A ruler who saw himself as guardian of the Constitution had become, for millions across the ocean, the very image of what they claimed to be escaping. That contradiction followed him. It did not make his later illness inevitable, but it made his vulnerability more visible and more dangerous. Once a king has been publicly blamed for losing part of an empire, his every weakness becomes easier to interpret as part of a larger failure. His opponents no longer need to invent doubts. History has handed them evidence. And still, there is something almost painfully human in the way George continued. He worked. He prayed. He clung to duty. He did not transform into a tragic figure overnight. The machinery of kingship kept moving, and he moved with it, carrying the burden of a defeat that could be argued about in Parliament, mocked in print, mourned in private, and never quite undone. The American Revolution left Britain with a constitutional lesson, an imperial recalculation, and a political reckoning. It left George III with something harder to measure, a crack in the image of command. And when the first unmistakable signs of his disorder began to gather in the years ahead, that crack would make the whole crown seem less secure. Chapter 6. The first signs in the shadows. The first signs did not arrive with the neatness that later history often gives them. No one in the palace woke one morning to find a clear line drawn between the healthy king and the afflicted one. Illness rarely respects the boundaries that biographers prefer. It gathers in fragments, a change in sleep, a strange burst of energy, a mood that seems out of proportion, a conversation that wanders, accelerates, or refuses to end. At first, such things can be explained away. A king is tired. A king is under pressure. A king has eaten badly, worked too late, worried too much, prayed too intensely, argued too long. And George III had reasons to be strained. He had carried the weight of war, imperial defeat, political hostility, and the endless grind of government. He was not an idle monarch drifting through ceremony. His mind was used every day in the practical business of rule. So when signs of disturbance began to appear, those around him did not immediately possess a single reliable category for what they were seeing. Was it bodily illness disturbing the mind? Was it melancholy? Was it mania? Was it a temporary fever of nerves? Was it punishment, weakness, exhaustion, or something lodged mysteriously in the blood? The 18th century had language for madness, but not the language we would use now. It also had deep anxieties about reputation. For an ordinary family, mental disturbance could be shameful. For a royal family, it could be explosive. The king's body was public, but the king's suffering had to be managed as a secret. That secrecy makes the early phase difficult to reconstruct with perfect confidence. Much of what we know comes through reports, letters, medical notes, and later interpretations, each shaped by its own purpose. People close to power rarely write with innocent hands. A doctor may defend his treatment. A politician may sharpen a crisis to suit an argument. A family member may soften what was unbearable. A later historian may see patterns that those in the room could not. Still, certain features return again and again. George became agitated. His sleep suffered. His speech could become rapid, pressured, and difficult to interrupt. He seemed at times overwhelmed by streams of thought that would not slow down. His mood shifted in ways that frightened observers, not merely because they were unpleasant, but because they appeared to loosen the ordinary restraints of royal behavior. For a man whose public identity had been built on discipline, this was alarming in a very particular way. A king may be angry. Courts are built to survive anger. A king may be stubborn. Ministers can work around stubbornness, though they complain while doing it. But a king whose speech cannot be trusted, whose judgment seems unstable, whose very attention cannot be reliably reached, that is a different kind of danger. The palace began to listen. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of a household becoming an instrument of observation. Footmen, physicians, courtiers, family members, secretaries, all watching for patterns. How long had he slept? What had he said? Did he recognize the person before him? Was the tone improved? Was the agitation rising? Had the king eaten? Had he prayed? Had he wandered into subjects best avoided? In such an atmosphere, every ordinary human action can become evidence. A restless night becomes a political symptom. A rambling sentence becomes a constitutional matter. A flash of tenderness offers hope. A burst of rage renews fear. Even recovery, or the appearance of recovery, becomes difficult to trust, because everyone has learned to suspect that the mind may turn again. This is one reason George's illness terrified Britain beyond the palace walls. It blurred categories that monarchy depended upon. The king was supposed to be both a person and more than a person. His human weakness could be acknowledged in small ways: fatigue, grief, irritation, age. But the sovereign's reason had to remain intact, because law and ceremony assumed that there was someone there capable of willing, consenting, refusing, appointing, approving. Madness, or what the age called madness, threatened that assumption. And yet, the word itself could conceal more than it revealed. To call George mad was to name a visible disorder without explaining its cause. It might satisfy political enemies, frighten loyal subjects, or simplify a complicated medical reality into one devastating label. But it did not answer the deeper question: what was happening inside him? Modern readers often want the diagnosis first. We want to classify, to compare symptoms, to settle the matter. Was it a psychiatric disorder? A metabolic disease? A neurological condition? A combination of factors misunderstood by everyone at the time? Those questions matter, and they will return later. But they can also distract us from how the illness was experienced in the moment. For the people around George, this was not a case study. It was a crisis unfolding hour by hour, inside rooms where etiquette no longer knew what to do with fear. The king could not simply be treated like any other patient, because every treatment touched the dignity of the crown. Yet he could not simply be treated like an untouchable sovereign either, because his condition seemed to demand intervention. This created an impossible intimacy. Physicians had to examine a man whom others bowed before. Servants had to witness scenes that official memory would prefer to smooth away. Family members had to love, fear, and sometimes resist the person at the center of the storm. Ministers had to ask, quietly at first, and then with growing urgency, whether government could continue if the king's mind did not return to steadiness. There is no need to exaggerate the drama. The facts are troubling enough. George III, the monarch who had tried to embody order, began to appear disordered. The man who had placed such faith in duty found himself becoming the object of other people's decisions. The king, who had insisted on the active importance of his own judgment, became, in the eyes of those around him, a question to be managed. And that transformation is the heart of the early mystery. Not merely that he was ill, but that his illness seemed to move him across a boundary no one wanted to name. He was still George, still husband, father, sovereign, still the man whose signature mattered, still the figure around whom the rituals of monarchy revolved. But at certain moments, he seemed unreachable, and for a nation already bruised by political conflict and imperial loss, that was enough to turn private symptoms into public dread. Chapter 7. The palace becomes a prison. By the autumn of 1788, the fragile boundary between royal privacy and national crisis began to give way. The king's condition could no longer be managed as a troubling irregularity, explained in softened phrases and kept behind the usual screens of court discretion. Something had changed. The household understood it first, because households always do. Before Parliament debates, before newspapers speculate, before ministers choose their language with surgical care, the people nearest the afflicted person learn the truth in smaller ways. A door kept shut, a voice carrying too long into the night, a servant summoned, dismissed, summoned again. A family member leaving a room with a face arranged too carefully. Palaces are designed to display power, but they are also very good at hiding distress. Their corridors create distance. Their rituals slow down panic. Their hierarchy decides who is allowed to know what and when. Yet during George III's major crisis of 1788 and 1789, even the architecture of monarchy could not fully contain the reality that the king's mind had become unpredictable. The palace, in that season, became less like a home than a guarded chamber around a national secret. This is not to say that George was simply locked away and forgotten. The situation was more complicated and more disturbing because those around him believed they were acting from necessity. He was ill. He could be agitated. He could speak with exhausting speed. His behavior frightened people who loved him and people who depended on him. The ordinary deference owed to a sovereign collided with the practical demands of care. And care, in the 18th century, could look very much like control. The king was watched. His movements were managed. His access to people was restricted. Doctors were brought close to a body that, under normal circumstances, would have been surrounded by ceremony and distance. The language used around him shifted. He was still addressed as a monarch, but he was increasingly treated as a patient. That change was immense. A king is accustomed to being obeyed. A patient may be contradicted. A king commands space. A patient may be confined for his own safety or for the safety of others. A king's words become instructions. A patient's words may become symptoms. Imagine the violence of that transformation for a man like George III. He had spent his life trying to master himself. He believed in discipline, order, prayer, duty, and moral restraint. Now his own household was being reorganized around the fear that he could not restrain himself. The dignity of the crown had to be protected from the king's own visible suffering. That is the terrible paradox of the crisis. Everyone wanted to preserve monarchy, but to preserve it, they had to limit the monarch. Court secrecy deepened the tension. Information about the king's condition was never neutral. A hopeful report could strengthen ministers who wanted to avoid a regency. A grim report could encourage those who saw the Prince of Wales as the inevitable substitute. Every medical bulletin, every rumor, every private letter carried political weight. The king's illness became a battlefield of interpretation. Was he improving? Was he lucid? Could he understand affairs of state? Was recovery likely? Who had the authority to decide? And who benefited from each answer? Inside the palace, those questions were not abstractions. They shaped access to the king himself. They shaped the tone of medical treatment. They shaped the emotional lives of Queen Charlotte and the royal children, who were forced to endure not only the distress of illness, but the public consequences of it. Charlotte's position was especially painful. She was wife, queen, mother, and witness. Her husband's suffering was intimate, but it was never hers alone to grieve. The nation had a claim on him. Parliament had a claim. Ministers had a claim. The physicians had a claim. Even political opponents had a claim, because the king's incapacity created opportunities they could not ignore. There is something almost indecent about that, though it was unavoidable. A private collapse had become public property. The medical men who entered this world did not bring certainty with them. They brought theories, habits, reputations, and confidence that could exceed their understanding. Some treatments were meant to soothe. Others were meant to discipline the body into obedience. The boundary between therapy and coercion was not always clear, especially when the patient resisted. In George's case, the patient was also the sovereign. That made every intervention morally awkward. If he refused, was he refusing as a rational king or resisting as an ill man? If he demanded release, was that command to be honored or interpreted as part of the disorder? If he spoke angrily to a doctor, was that royal displeasure or medical evidence? The crisis exposed a question monarchy preferred not to ask. Where exactly did the king end and the human being begin? For the public, only fragments emerged. Rumor did much of the work that official silence could not. In coffeehouses, pamphlets, drawing rooms, and political circles, the king's condition became a subject of speculation. But speculation was dangerous. Too much frankness could seem disloyal. Too much concealment could look like conspiracy. Britain had to discuss the mind of its king while pretending, in some ways, that the discussion itself was improper. This gave the crisis its strange atmosphere. Half medical emergency, half constitutional suspense. The king was alive, but could he reign? He was crowned, but could he consent? He was present, but was he reachable enough for government to function through him? The palace walls could not answer those questions. They could only hold the man at the center of them. And perhaps that is why this period remains so haunting. Not because of one dramatic scene, one locked door, one cruel doctor, or one whispered diagnosis, but because of the slow inversion of royal life. The place built to protect the king's majesty became a place where his freedom narrowed. The people trained to obey him began deciding what he should hear, where he should go, and whom he should see. The crown did not fall. That is important. There was no revolution in the corridors, no sudden collapse of monarchy. Instead, something quieter and more revealing happened. The institution began instinctively separating itself from the man. The king could be confined, observed, treated, and politically bypassed in discussion, while the crown continued to be defended in his name. That separation was not yet complete. It was improvised under pressure, shaped by fear and necessity. But once imagined, it could not be entirely forgotten. George III's palace had become a prison, though not one built of simple cruelty. It was built of loyalty, panic, medicine, politics, and the desperate wish that the king might return to himself before the nation was forced to decide what he had become. Chapter 8. Doctors, Restraints, and Georgian Medicine. To understand what happened to George III, we have to enter a medical world that could observe suffering with great intensity and still misunderstand what it was seeing. Georgian medicine was not empty superstition. That would be an easy insult from the safety of later centuries. Physicians of the 18th century could be intelligent, experienced, and sincerely devoted to their patients. They studied symptoms closely. They kept records. They argued about causes. They recognized that the body and mind influenced one another, even if their explanations often now seem incomplete or mistaken. But they worked with limited tools. They had no modern psychiatry, no brain imaging, no reliable laboratory testing in the way we would understand it, no clear distinction between neurological illness, metabolic disorder, psychiatric crisis, infection, exhaustion, and the many physical conditions that can alter mood, sleep, speech, and judgment. So when the king became ill, his doctors faced a problem larger than one man. They were trying to treat a mystery using a medicine of imbalance, observation, restraint, and theory. The body was imagined as something that could be corrected by removing, purging, calming, stimulating, confining, or redirecting. Treatments were often based on the belief that disorder had to be driven out or subdued. For George, this could mean an intensely physical form of care. He was examined. He was regulated. He was subjected to treatments meant to restore order to a system believed to have gone wrong. Some accounts describe methods that now feel harsh, even brutal. Confinement, restraint, blistering, purging, and other interventions that reflected the medical logic of the age. The aim was not necessarily cruelty. That is important. But good intentions do not make suffering gentler. A treatment can be both sincere and tormenting. This is one of the hardest parts of George's story to judge fairly. If we look only with modern disgust, we miss how frightened and uncertain everyone was. If we look only with historical sympathy, we risk smoothing over the reality that the king endured forms of treatment that could strip away dignity at the very moment he was most vulnerable. He was not merely ill, he was handled, and because he was king, that handling carried an almost theatrical reversal of power. The man whose presence could make a room bend into ceremony was now being managed by physicians whose authority came from the claim that they understood his condition better than he did. The name most often associated with George's treatment is Dr. Francis Willis, a clergyman-physician who had gained a reputation for treating mental disturbance. Willis approached insanity with a mixture of religious discipline, medical confidence, and practical control. His methods reflected a belief that the patient's mind could be brought back into obedience through firm management. That word, obedience, matters. In ordinary political life, George had expected obedience from others. In illness, obedience was demanded of him. The moral logic of the treatment echoed the moral logic of the king's own life, but turned against him in a painful way. George had believed in restraint, duty, discipline, and command over the self. His doctors, especially those who believed in firm control, treated his disorder almost as a rebellion within the person. The task was to bring the unruly self back under authority. There is a grim symmetry in that. The king, who had resisted rebellious colonies, now found his own mind interpreted as a territory in revolt. We should be careful with that comparison, of course. Illness is not politics, and a suffering person is not an empire. But the language of control surrounded both. In the 18th century, order was not merely a political value. It was a medical one, a domestic one, a spiritual one. Disorder, wherever it appeared, demanded correction. The problem was that no one knew exactly what was being corrected. Some believed the illness lay in the nerves. Some looked to the stomach, the blood, the bowels, the skin, the brain, the passions, the pressures of office, or the mysterious workings of providence. The same symptom could be read in several ways. Insomnia might be a sign of mental excitement. Rapid speech might suggest mania. Physical pain might point toward bodily disease. Changes in urine or complexion could lead doctors down another path entirely. To the modern eye, the uncertainty is striking. To the people in the room, uncertainty was dangerous. A physician treating a king could not simply shrug and confess helplessness. Royal illness demanded confidence, or at least the performance of confidence. Ministers needed reports. The Queen needed reassurance. The nation needed the sense that someone, somewhere, knew what was happening. Medicine became part of politics. A doctor's opinion could affect the Regency Crisis. If George was likely to recover soon, then delaying a transfer of authority made sense. If he was permanently incapacitated, delay looked irresponsible. A medical judgment could strengthen one faction and weaken another. In that atmosphere, even a pulse could become political evidence. This pressure did not necessarily make doctors dishonest, but it made neutrality almost impossible. Their diagnoses, predictions, and rivalries unfolded under the gaze of a state trying to decide whether the king remained capable of rule. And still, amid all the constitutional drama, there was a patient. This point is easy to lose. George's suffering has often been discussed through the effects it had on monarchy. The crisis, the Regency debates, the constitutional consequences, the later theories of disease. But inside the event was a man experiencing fear, confusion, exhaustion, humiliation, and perhaps moments of terrible clarity about his own loss of control. Imagine being treated as both sacred and suspect. Every word you say is listened to, but not always believed. Every protest may be dismissed as symptom. Every attempt to assert yourself may be taken as proof that others must assert control over you. The more you insist you are king, the more your insistence may seem like evidence that you cannot be trusted with kingship. That is the trap of royal illness. For an ordinary patient, loss of autonomy is painful. For George, it was constitutionally absurd and personally devastating. His identity had been built around lawful command. Illness placed him in a world where command no longer reliably worked. The restraints used in such treatment were not only physical. They were social, verbal, political. Access was restrained. Information was restrained. His public image was restrained, shaped into bulletins and rumors. Even the story of his illness was restrained by the needs of monarchy. Yet the body spoke anyway. It spoke in sleeplessness, agitation, torrents of words, exhaustion, recovery, relapse. It spoke in ways physicians tried to translate and politicians tried to use. It spoke across centuries, still refusing to settle into one comfortable diagnosis. This is why the medical story of George III remains so unsettling. It is not merely that the treatments were harsh. It is that they reveal how a society responds when authority becomes vulnerable. People gather around the afflicted figure with remedies, theories, ambitions, loyalties, fears, and certainties. Some want to heal. Some want to protect. Some want advantage. Often, the same person wants more than one of these things at once. Georgian medicine tried to restore George to himself, but it also helped expose how fragile the idea of himself had become. Was he the king issuing commands? The patient resisting treatment? The husband in distress? The constitutional obstacle? The sacred person of monarchy? The suffering body in a bed? The doctors could treat symptoms. They could enforce calm. They could report improvement. But they could not fully resolve the deeper problem his illness had created. A crown can sit steadily on a table. It is much harder to keep steady on a human head. Chapter 9. The Prince Waiting in the Wings. While George III's physicians watched the king's body for signs of recovery, politicians watched something else. They watched the Prince of Wales. He was the king's eldest son, also named George, and he stood close enough to power to make every tremor in his father's condition politically meaningful. In ordinary times, an heir waits. He attends ceremonies, cultivates allies, irritates his parents, accumulates debts, and imagines the future with more confidence than experience deserves. But during the crisis of 1788 and 1789, waiting became a political act. The Prince of Wales was not simply a dutiful son standing quietly beside a sick father. He had his own circle, his own reputation, and his own tensions with the king. Where George III projected domestic restraint, moral seriousness, and almost stubborn self-command, his son became associated with pleasure, extravagance, and opposition society. The contrast was too obvious for contemporaries to ignore. Father and son seemed to embody two different visions of monarchy. The king believed in discipline. The prince moved through a world of appetite and display. The king valued duty as a sacred burden. The prince appeared to many as a man impatient for freedom, influence, and recognition. This contrast can be overstated. Heirs to thrones often look irresponsible because they possess rank without full responsibility. They are close to authority, but not quite inside it. They are watched, judged, flattered, restricted, and tempted. The Prince of Wales did not create this awkward position. He inherited it. Still, he occupied it with enough flamboyance to alarm those who feared what a regency under him might mean. The question was not merely personal. If the king could not govern, who should act in his place? The obvious answer seemed to be the Prince of Wales. Blood pointed toward him. Custom seemed to lean toward him. Ambition certainly did not discourage him. But Britain's constitution was not quite so simple. A regent was not a crowned king. The sovereign was still alive. The prince could not inherit the throne while his father breathed, and the law had to decide what powers, limits, and conditions would attach to any temporary authority. The crisis created a strange political creature, a ruler who might rule because the king could not, but whose authority had to be defined because the king still existed. This was where family pain became constitutional argument. The prince's allies had reason to favor a broad regency. If George, Prince of Wales, was to act as regent, why should he not possess the full practical powers of monarchy? If government needed a substitute sovereign, a weak substitute might be worse than none. The opposition, particularly those who expected influence under the prince, saw opportunity in the king's incapacity. On the other side stood ministers who had served George III and had no wish to surrender power to a prince aligned with their political enemies. William Pitt the Younger, then Prime Minister, approached the problem with caution and calculation. He argued that Parliament had the right to determine the terms of a regency. This was not just a legal technicality, it was a way of preventing the prince from stepping automatically into full royal authority. Behind the constitutional language lay a brutal reality. The king's illness had opened a door, and different men disagreed over how wide it should be. For the Prince of Wales, the situation must have been morally uncomfortable, though not necessarily in ways that ennobled him. His father's suffering created his opportunity. Every day, the king failed to recover, strengthened the argument for a regency. Every sign of improvement threatened to send him back into waiting. No son should have to calculate power beside a sick parent. No heir is entirely free from doing so. That is the cold design of monarchy. It turns family sequence into political structure. Birth order becomes constitutional planning. A father's decline becomes a son's approach to authority. Private emotion is never allowed to remain private for long, because the kingdom has organized itself around the body of one family. The tension between George III and the Prince of Wales had been building before the illness. The king disapproved of his son's habits and debts. The prince resented restraint and gravitated toward circles unfriendly to his father's ministers. Their relationship contained the ordinary generational quarrels of a strict parent and a restless adult child, but magnified by crown, money, faction, and public scrutiny. During the Regency drama, those tensions hardened into national significance. Support for the prince did not always mean affection for him. Some politicians saw him as a route back to office. Some saw him as a symbol of opposition to the king's influence. Others may simply have believed that the heir had the clearest claim to act. Likewise, resistance to the prince was not always pure loyalty to the king. It could be loyalty mixed with fear, principle mixed with political survival. This is why the crisis is so revealing. It shows that monarchy was never only about reverence. It was also about access. Whoever stood nearest the sovereign, or nearest the person replacing him, could shape appointments, policy, patronage, and careers. The king's mind may have been the visible problem, but the deeper struggle concerned the control of legitimate power. And in the middle of that struggle was a family whose pain was being converted into procedure. Queen Charlotte feared for her husband and for the dignity of the crown. The Prince of Wales waited with a mixture of concern, frustration, and political expectation. Ministers measured the king's symptoms against parliamentary timetables. Opposition leaders prepared arguments. Doctors became unwilling witnesses in a contest over authority. The result was a strange emotional weather. Grief mixed with ambition, loyalty mixed with calculation, hope mixed with inconvenience. It would be comforting to imagine that illness purifies politics, that a suffering king would cause all factions to lower their voices. It did not. Illness made politics more careful, perhaps, but not less political. Men learned to speak in solemn tones while still counting consequences. The Prince of Wales understood that his father's incapacity could transform him from ornament into ruler. But he also understood, or soon learned, that his path to power would not be automatic. Parliament would not simply bow to biology. The crown might pass by blood at death, but temporary authority in life was another matter. That distinction mattered enormously. If Parliament could define the Regency, then the institution of monarchy was being quietly subordinated to constitutional management. The prince might be heir by nature, but he would be regent by law. His power would not descend like sunlight. It would be constructed, debated, limited, and granted. For George III, had he been able to grasp the full drama clearly, this would have been bitter. His own illness threatened to elevate the son, whose conduct he distrusted, and empower political enemies he had long resisted. His household crisis became the opening through which another court might form around another George. The father was still alive. That was the haunting fact. The Prince of Wales was not replacing a dead king. He was waiting beside a living one whose authority had become uncertain. He was not inheriting a throne so much as approaching a vacancy that no one wanted to call a vacancy. And that is why his presence intensified the terror of the moment. The king's illness alone was frightening, but the prince gave that illness a direction. He made incapacity visible as succession, ambition, rearrangement. He reminded Britain that if the mind of the monarch failed, power would not pause respectfully in the doorway. It would move toward the next person able to claim it. Chapter 10. A nation debates the mind of a king. The illness of George III forced Britain to ask a question it had carefully avoided. What happens when the king is alive, but cannot rule? Death had a ritual answer. Succession was painful, but clear. The old sovereign died. The new sovereign inherited. Bells rang. Proclamations were made. Mourning began, and the state continued under another name. But incapacity was different. It left the crown suspended between presence and absence. George III still existed. He was still the lawful king. His authority had not passed to anyone else. And yet, if he could not understand, decide, consent, or communicate reliably, then the ordinary channels of government were blocked by a living body. This was not merely a palace problem. It became a national argument. Parliament had to debate what could be done without pretending the king was dead, and without pretending that nothing serious had happened. Ministers needed legal authority. The opposition saw opportunity. The Prince of Wales waited close to power. The public followed rumors and reports with a mixture of concern, loyalty, curiosity, and fear. The kingdom had become a courtroom for the king's mind. The central issue was deceptively simple. Who had the right to appoint a regent, and on what terms? To the prince and many of his allies, the answer seemed natural. As heir apparent, he should assume the powers needed to govern during his father's incapacity. The bloodline that would one day give him the throne should, in their view, give him the right to act when the king could not. But William Pitt the Younger and his supporters resisted the idea of an automatic, unrestricted claim. They argued that Parliament must determine the conditions of a regency. The king's incapacity created a gap in the working constitution, and that gap could not be filled by inheritance alone. This may sound like a legal quarrel dressed in wigs and careful phrasing. It was more than that. At stake was whether royal authority, even temporarily, flowed by birth or by parliamentary settlement. If the Prince of Wales could simply step into the king's powers because he was next in line, then monarchy retained a kind of natural force beyond parliamentary control. If Parliament could define, limit, and grant those powers, then the crown itself was being shown to depend on the constitutional nation around it. No one needed to say this too loudly. Everyone could feel it. The debate was dangerous because it touched the sacred without openly profaning it. Politicians had to discuss the king's inability while maintaining reverence for the king. They had to plan for a government without George while publicly hoping for George's return. They had to measure incapacity without seeming eager to declare it. Language became careful, almost slippery. A man could speak of temporary provision rather than replacement. He could describe the king's condition with sympathy while using it to advance a constitutional position. He could insist on loyalty to the monarch while preparing to transfer power away from him. The political class became expert, for a season, in sounding grief-stricken while maneuvering intensely. That does not mean the grief was false. Many people sincerely loved George III, or at least valued what he represented. He had become, to loyal subjects, a familiar figure of domestic virtue and national steadiness. The thought of him reduced to confusion or confinement was genuinely distressing. Public prayers for his recovery were not merely theater. They reflected a society in which the king's health still seemed tied to the moral and political health of the realm. But politics rarely leaves sincerity untouched. For the opposition, the Regency promised a change in power. The Prince of Wales was associated with circles hostile to Pitt's ministry. If he became regent with full authority, offices might change hands. Patronage might be redirected. The balance of government could shift overnight, not through an election or royal death, but through medical uncertainty. For Pitt, the stakes were personal as well as constitutional. His ministry depended on the existing king's support. A regent friendly to his enemies could remove him. So when Pitt defended Parliament's right to limit the Regency, he was defending a principle, but also his own political survival. This is one of the useful discomforts of history. People often act from mixed motives. A constitutional argument can be intellectually serious and politically convenient at the same time. A man may believe his own reasoning and still benefit from it handsomely. To reduce everything to self-interest is cynical. To ignore self-interest is naive. The Regency Crisis sits exactly in that uncomfortable middle. Outside Parliament, the public consumed the drama through rumor, print, conversation, satire, and official updates. The king's condition became a national subject, but not one that could be discussed freely without risk. Too much mockery might seem cruel or treasonous. Too much secrecy encouraged suspicion. Too much optimism looked like manipulation. Too much realism threatened panic. The public wanted to know whether the king was recovering. Politicians wanted to know whether they should act before he recovered. That difference mattered. If George's illness was temporary, then sweeping changes might look indecent. Why reorder the Constitution if the king might soon resume his duties? But if his condition was likely to last, delay became irresponsible. A government cannot live indefinitely on hopeful bulletins, so the nation found itself waiting on medical interpretation. Physicians, who could not truly predict the future, were pressed to make their observations politically useful. Improvement could slow the push toward regency. Relapse could accelerate it. Every report from the royal sick room carried consequences far beyond medicine. This gave George's suffering an almost unbearable exposure. He was not simply being observed as a patient. He was being translated into policy. His sleep, speech, agitation, calmness, recognition, and coherence became evidence in a constitutional debate. A private symptom might alter the confidence of a minister. A better morning might delay a bill. A worse night might revive the prince's hopes. The inner weather of one man became the public weather of the state. And yet, through all this, Britain did not collapse. That is important. The crisis was frightening, but it also revealed a strange resilience. Parliament argued. Ministers calculated. Doctors disagreed. The prince waited. Rumors multiplied. But the political system did not dissolve into chaos. Instead, it improvised. It searched for a legal path through a situation the Constitution had not fully settled in advance. This improvisation was not graceful. It was tense, partisan, and emotionally tangled. But it mattered because it showed that the crown, however sacred in language, could be managed as an institution when the person of the king became unable to perform his role. That lesson would echo later. At the time, however, no one could know how long the crisis would last. The country stood in a peculiar half-light. The king might recover, in which case too much eagerness for regency would look disloyal. He might not recover, in which case too much delay would look reckless. The prince might soon wield authority, or he might be pushed back into frustrated expectation. Pitt might fall, or he might survive. Everything depended on a mind no one could command. The debate over George III's illness was therefore more than a debate about one king. It was a rehearsal for modern constitutional monarchy. It forced Britain to distinguish between loyalty to a person and continuity of government. It forced politicians to admit, however quietly, that the crown could not be allowed to depend entirely on the uninterrupted reason of the monarch. This was the hidden transformation inside the crisis. The king's body remained sacred. His suffering was treated with solemn concern. His recovery was prayed for. But the state began to think around him. Not against him, at least not openly, around him. That small shift changed everything, because once a nation learns to imagine government continuing while the king is unreachable, monarchy becomes less a personal command and more an office. Still powerful, still revered, but no longer identical with the living mind of the sovereign. George III had not abdicated. He had not died. He had not willingly surrendered power. Yet his illness forced Britain to glimpse a future in which the crown could survive, even when the king could not fully inhabit it. Chapter 11. Recovery, Relief, and the Illusion of Safety. When George III began to recover, Britain exhaled. The relief was not quiet. It moved through the country with the force of a public deliverance. Bells rang, prayers of thanksgiving were offered, addresses of loyalty were prepared and presented. Illuminations brightened streets that had recently been darkened by rumor. The king's return to reason was treated not only as a medical improvement, but as a kind of national restoration. The word recovery did enormous work. It suggested that the crisis had ended. It allowed ministers to step back from the edge of regency. It allowed loyal subjects to believe their prayers had been answered. It allowed the royal household to imagine, or at least to hope, that the terrible inversion of palace life could be undone. The king was himself again, or close enough. And in politics, close enough can be powerful. For William Pitt, George's recovery was a rescue. The regency arrangements that might have elevated the Prince of Wales and swept Pitt from office were halted before they could fully take effect. The king's return preserved the ministry and embarrassed those who had prepared too eagerly for another center of power. Men who had spoken solemnly about constitutional necessity now had to adjust their faces to celebration. This is one of the subtler cruelties of the episode. A sick man's improvement became a political victory for some and a disappointment for others. No one respectable could admit that disappointment too plainly. Publicly, everyone rejoiced. Privately, calculations changed. The Prince of Wales, who had stood near the threshold of authority, was pushed back into waiting. His allies lost the immediate prospect of influence. Pitt emerged strengthened, not simply because the king had recovered, but because the recovery seemed to vindicate caution. Delay had worked. That lesson could be comforting, but it was also dangerous. It encouraged the belief that time itself had solved the problem, that if the nation simply waited long enough, the king would return and the Constitution would not have to make its hardest decision. In 1789, that appeared to be true. The country celebrated because it wanted the simpler story. The sovereign had been afflicted. The nation had prayed. The physicians had labored. The danger had passed. The crown had endured. There is truth in that story. George did recover sufficiently to resume royal duties. His return mattered. It was not just propaganda or wishful thinking. The machinery of government, which had been creaking under uncertainty, could operate again through its familiar channels. The king could meet ministers, consent, approve, and appear publicly as the living center of the monarchy. But recovery did not erase what had been revealed. For several months, Britain had seen the crown's dependence on the mind of one man. It had watched ministers prepare for government around a living sovereign. It had heard Parliament debate the limits of an heir's temporary authority. It had learned that loyalty to the king and continuity of the state were not always the same thing. Those lessons did not vanish because the king smiled again. They retreated. That is often how institutions survive shocks. They do not necessarily resolve the problem. They fold it away, wrap it in celebration, and hope they will not need to unwrap it soon. In George's case, public thanksgiving helped transform a constitutional trauma into a providential story. The emphasis shifted from danger to deliverance. This was emotionally understandable. People needed relief. The royal family needed relief. The king himself, emerging from an ordeal that had subjected him to confinement, treatment, scrutiny, and humiliation, needed the dignity of return. A public celebration could help restore what illness had damaged. It could say, in effect, "We still recognize you. You are still our king." The terrible months did not define you completely. There is a mercy in that. But there is also an illusion, because the question left behind was not whether George could recover once. He had. The question was whether it might happen again. That possibility sat like a sealed letter inside the rain. It could not be publicly handled too roughly. No stable monarchy wants to live under constant speculation about the sovereign's mind. To dwell on recurrence would be disloyal, indecent, and politically destabilizing. So the nation leaned toward gratitude. It preferred to see the illness as a frightening episode rather than a warning. George himself seems to have resumed his duties with seriousness. This fits the pattern of his life. Duty was not something he could lay aside simply because he had suffered. If anything, recovery may have deepened the emotional urgency of returning to order. The papers, audiences, prayers, family rhythms, and state responsibilities offered not only work, but proof that he was still himself. A person recovering from mental crisis often faces a burden outsiders underestimate: the need to regain trust. Not merely trust from others, though that matters. Trust in one's own mind. Trust that sleep will hold. Trust that speech will remain steady. Trust that a strange mood is only a mood, not the first movement of another descent. For a king, That private vigilance would have been magnified by the knowledge that any visible disturbance might restart national fear. Recovery, then, was not a simple return to the old world. It was a return under observation. The court could resume its forms, but those who had witnessed the crisis could not unknow what they had seen. Ministers could consult the king, but perhaps with an added alertness. Family members could hope, but hope now carried memory. Doctors could claim success, but success in such cases is never quite the same as certainty. That uncertainty is why the public joy of 1789 feels, from a distance, both moving and fragile. The celebrations were real. The loyalty was real. The relief was real. But beneath them lay a vulnerability no illumination could burn away. Britain had discovered that the monarchy could be shaken not by invasion, rebellion, or assassination, but by something internal, invisible, and resistant to command. The king had returned from behind the veil of illness, yet the veil remained in the room. And perhaps the most haunting thing about this recovery is that it restored the very system that had nearly been overwhelmed. George resumed his place as if the old assumptions could continue. The king as moral center, active ruler, paternal figure, guardian of order. The public wanted that image. The Constitution still used it. The court performed it. But now the image had a crack. Not a visible crack. Not one polite society would point at during celebration, but a crack nonetheless. It ran through the idea that sovereignty could be safely housed in a single human mind without contingency. It ran through the faith that the crown's dignity could protect the king from bodily and mental vulnerability. It ran through the comforting belief that a recovered monarch was the same as an unthreatened monarchy. For a time, Britain chose relief over reckoning. That choice may have been necessary. Nations, like families, cannot live forever in emergency. They need ceremonies that say the danger has passed, even when memory knows the matter is not so simple. So George III returned. The king appeared again before his people, not as a ghost of the crisis, but as the sovereign restored. For those who loved him, it must have felt miraculous. For those who had feared constitutional rupture, it felt like reprieve. For those who had hoped the prince would rise, it was a door closing. For George, perhaps, it was something quieter and harder. A return to duty after having become, for a season, the duty of everyone else. Chapter 12. The Illness Returns. The recovery of George III did not close the story. It only taught Britain how badly it wanted the story to be closed. For a time, the king's return allowed the nation to behave as if the crisis had been contained inside a single season of fear. The machinery of government resumed its familiar rhythm. The court recovered its surface. The public had its thanksgiving, its loyal addresses, its illuminated streets, its comforting memory of danger overcome. But illness does not always respect the ceremony of recovery. George's later episodes returned like a truth the monarchy had tried to place out of sight. Each recurrence carried the old terror, but not in quite the same form. The first major crisis had shocked Britain because it seemed almost unthinkable. Later illness frightened people because it proved the unthinkable could repeat. That difference matters. A single breakdown may be treated as an exception. A recurrence becomes a pattern. And once a pattern exists, the future changes shape. Every improvement carries a question inside it. Every ordinary day can feel provisional. Those closest to the king could never again experience stability innocently. The palace had learned to listen. Sleep, speech, appetite, agitation, withdrawal, sudden intensity, all the small human fluctuations that might pass unnoticed in another life became signs to be interpreted. A king cannot easily have a bad week. His household may wonder whether the nation is approaching another emergency. His ministers may wonder whether decisions should be hurried, delayed, or quietly prepared around him. His family may wonder whether the man before them is returning to himself or beginning to slip away again. This is one of the cruelties of recurrent illness. It turns memory into surveillance. George III continued to be a working monarch for many years after the first great crisis. That fact should not be lost. He was not simply absent from history after 1789. He remained involved in government, family, and the public life of the crown. Britain fought revolutionary France, then Napoleonic France. The political world around him changed with astonishing force. Empires shifted, ideologies hardened, old certainties trembled across Europe. And through much of this, George continued to stand as the figure of continuity. But the memory of his illness had altered the meaning of that continuity. It was no longer the untroubled endurance of a steady patriarch. It was endurance with a shadow attached. When later episodes came, they did not unfold in a vacuum. Everyone remembered. The doctors remembered the sick room. Ministers remembered the constitutional scramble. The Prince of Wales remembered how close he had once come to power. Queen Charlotte remembered the intimate cost. The public, though not always fully informed, remembered enough to understand that the king's health could become the nation's crisis. The emotional burden on the royal family is easy to flatten into political drama, but it deserves more careful attention. For Queen Charlotte, recurrence meant the return of fear inside marriage. She was not simply watching a king fail. She was watching her husband suffer. Yet because he was king, her role as wife could never be purely private. Her grief had protocol around it. Her worry had political consequences. Even her access to him could become part of a larger contest over control and information. For the royal children, the situation was no less tangled. A father's illness is painful in any family. In this family, it also shaped rank, expectation, money, status, and future power. The Prince of Wales, especially, remained trapped in the uneasy position of heir to a living father whose incapacity might at any moment raise him toward authority. Sympathy and ambition did not have to exclude one another. That is what made the situation morally uncomfortable. It is tempting to cast the prince as merely impatient. He often gave critics enough material for that judgment. But monarchy itself helped create the ugliness. It made a son's advancement dependent on a father's decline. It made waiting a public condition. It made private frustration politically useful to others. Each recurrence also strained ministers in a different way. Government depends on timing. Decisions cannot always wait for recovery, but acting too quickly can look opportunistic or disloyal. A minister close to the king had to judge not only policy, but capacity. Could the sovereign understand the issue? Could he give meaningful approval? Was a difficult audience simply difficult, or constitutionally unreliable? At what point does respect become evasion? These questions are not as dramatic as a locked room or a physician's restraint, but they may have been more corrosive over time. Because the state had to keep functioning. The law did not pause whenever the king's condition worsened. War did not pause. Patronage did not pause. Party conflict did not pause. Foreign governments did not politely wait for clarity in Windsor. The machinery of rule had to adapt around uncertainty, and each adaptation quietly weakened the old idea that the monarch's personal command was indispensable. This does not mean George became irrelevant. Far from it. His views, affections, prejudices, and principles continued to matter. But his illness made it harder to pretend that the Constitution could rely solely on his uninterrupted judgment. There is a slow education happening here, almost beneath the surface. The first crisis taught Britain that regency might be necessary. Later crises taught Britain that incapacity was not a bizarre exception, but a recurring possibility. And recurring possibilities demand systems, not just prayers. Yet people still prayed. They still hoped for recovery because hope was both emotional and political. The return of the king spared everyone from decisions they did not want to make. It preserved the familiar structure. It delayed conflict. It allowed the country to imagine that the father of the nation, however shaken, remained fundamentally present. But recurrence changes even hope. Hope becomes cautious. It stops sounding like confidence and begins to sound like bargaining. Let him sleep tonight. Let the agitation pass. Let the reports improve. Let the ministers manage. Let the prince wait a little longer. Let the country not have to look directly at what this means. For George himself, the burden is harder to reach, because the evidence comes to us through observers who were themselves frightened, interested, or limited. But we can say this much with care. A man who valued self-command must have found repeated loss of command profoundly humiliating. If he retained awareness in intervals, he may have understood that his illness had made him vulnerable not only to suffering, but to interpretation. Others were turning his condition into reports, arguments, strategies, and precedents. That is a lonely fate. It is possible to be surrounded by attendants and still be isolated by the way people look at you, not with indifference necessarily, with concern, with calculation, with fear, with pity. Pity can be its own kind of distance. As the episodes returned, the monarchy learned to survive them by separating the king's symbolic value from his practical capacity. This separation was never announced as a revolution. No one rang bells to celebrate the shrinking of personal monarchy. But the shift was real. The crown could still represent continuity even when the king's mind did not provide it. The institution could borrow his name, while others quietly managed the work around his limitations. That was not betrayal, at least not simply. It was adaptation. And adaptation is often how old institutions avoid collapse. They do not always reform from principle. Sometimes they reform because a human body forces them to. The later recurrences of George's illness, therefore, did more than deepen a personal tragedy. They trained Britain to imagine a monarchy less dependent on the monarch. They made the unthinkable administratively thinkable. They turned fear into procedure, and procedure into precedent. Still, beneath the constitutional lessons, there remains the man. A king who returned, failed, returned again, and failed again. A family that could not trust relief for long. A government that learned to read symptoms like dispatches. A nation that wanted its sovereign restored because restoration meant not having to change too much, too quickly. The illness returned because illness often does, but each return took something with it. Not the crown. The crown endured. It took confidence. It took privacy. It took the illusion that George III's reign could be understood only through duty empire, and politics, without also reckoning with the fragile, recurring rebellion of the mind and body beneath the crown. Chapter 13, Porphyria, Bipolar Disorder, or Something Else. Long after George III was dead, another struggle began. Not in Parliament, not in the palace, not between the king and his doctors, or between Pitt and the Prince of Wales. This time, the struggle was over diagnosis. What exactly had happened to George III? For generations, the answer seemed simple enough for popular history. He had gone mad. The phrase was short, memorable, and cruelly convenient. It turned a complicated human condition into a label that could be carried through textbooks, plays, films, jokes, and national memory. The Mad King became easier to remember than the disciplined monarch, the family man, the political actor, or the suffering patient. But labels that survive are not always labels that explain. In the 20th century, a different theory gained force. George may have suffered from porphyria, a group of disorders affecting the body's production of heme, an important component in blood. Certain forms can produce severe physical symptoms, and in some cases, disturbances that may appear psychiatric. The theory was attractive because it seemed to rescue George from the old stigma of madness. It suggested that his mental symptoms were not signs of moral weakness or pure insanity, but manifestations of a physical disease misunderstood by Georgian medicine. There was a certain justice in that impulse. For too long, mental illness had been treated as shame, spectacle, or political embarrassment. To search for a bodily explanation was, in part, to restore dignity. It reminded people that what looks like madness may emerge from complex processes inside the body, processes that 18th century doctors could not have seen clearly even when they recorded symptoms carefully. The porphyria theory also had narrative power. It offered a hidden key: the strange behavior, the agitation, the pain, the possible changes in urine, the repeated attacks, the recoveries and relapses. All of it could be gathered into one medical explanation. History loves a locked room, and diagnosis can feel like the moment the door finally opens. But the door did not stay open. Later, researchers challenged the porphyria explanation. Some argued that the evidence was weaker than it appeared, or that symptoms had been selected and interpreted through the desire to prove the theory. Others suggested that George's episodes may be better understood through modern psychiatric categories, including bipolar disorder, perhaps involving manic episodes. His pressured speech, sleeplessness, agitation, and periods of apparent recovery can seem, to many modern eyes, to point in that direction. Yet here, too, caution is necessary. Diagnosing across centuries is a risky business. The patient cannot be examined. The records were not created for our categories. Observers wrote in the language of their own time, shaped by fear, politics, loyalty, medical fashion, and personal bias. A symptom that seems obvious to us may have been described imprecisely. A detail that looks medically important may have been exaggerated, misunderstood, or copied through later accounts. The evidence is real, but it reaches us through glass. This is why the question of George's illness remains so fascinating and so difficult. It sits at the meeting point of medicine, politics, and memory. Every diagnosis carries an interpretation of the man. Porphyria emphasizes hidden bodily disease. Bipolar disorder emphasizes a pattern of mood and thought. Other explanations look toward neurological illness, combined physical and psychiatric factors, or the possibility that no single label can capture the whole condition. And perhaps that last possibility deserves more respect than it usually receives. The desire to solve George III is understandable. A diagnosis gives shape to suffering. It protects us from the unease of uncertainty. It allows us to say, "This is what happened. This is why he changed. This is why the king vanished behind his own eyes." But historical illness does not always submit to that kind of closure. Consider the problem of the sources. The people watching George were rarely neutral observers. Physicians had reputations to defend. Politicians had outcomes to prefer. Family members had pain to manage. Later writers had theories to strengthen. Even sympathetic accounts could distort, because compassion itself can choose certain details and soften others. Then there is the problem of translation. Terms used in the 18th century do not map cleanly onto modern medicine. Madness, delirium, nervous disorder, fever, melancholy, and related descriptions could cover a wide range of conditions. The boundaries between physical and mental illness were understood differently. Doctors might focus on digestion, bile, pulse, skin, sleep, or moral behavior in ways that do not align with modern diagnostic systems. And modern categories, for all their usefulness, are not magic keys. They are tools. Good tools, often, but tools designed for living patients, observed directly within contemporary medical frameworks. When applied backward to a monarch surrounded by anxious courtiers and political crisis, they must be used with humility. What we can say with more confidence is that George III experienced severe, recurring episodes involving both mental and physical disturbance. These episodes affected his speech, sleep, mood, behavior, and capacity to govern. They were serious enough to require confinement and treatment. They were visible enough to trigger constitutional crisis. They returned often enough to change the future of monarchy. That may sound less satisfying than a final diagnosis, but it is more honest. The debate itself reveals something important about us. Each generation has tried to remake George's illness in its own language. The 18th century saw disorder through the lenses of nerves, humors, morality, providence, and authority. The 19th and early 20th centuries often preserved the simplified image of madness. The later 20th century, eager for biomedical explanation, turned toward Porphyria. More recent interpretations have questioned that theory and returned attention to psychiatric possibilities. The king's suffering became a mirror for changing ideas about the mind and body. That is why this question has refused to disappear. It is not only about George. It is about how societies decide what kind of suffering deserves sympathy. A physical disease is often granted dignity more readily than a psychiatric one. A metabolic disorder can seem blameless in a way that madness, unfairly and wrongly, has not always seemed. The argument over George's diagnosis therefore carries a moral weight beyond medical curiosity. It asks whether we need his illness to be physical in order to treat him humanely. We should not. Whether George suffered from porphyria, bipolar disorder, another condition, or a combination we cannot reconstruct, the basic truth remains: he was ill. His illness was not a joke, not a moral failure, not a convenient symbol to be flattened into caricature. It was a profound human crisis that became a national one because of where history had placed him. The uncertainty should not make the story weaker. It makes it more serious. A false certainty would give us a cleaner ending. But George III's life does not offer clean endings. His symptoms moved through the palace as fear, through parliament as crisis, through medicine as dispute, and through history as legend. The diagnosis remains unsettled because the evidence is incomplete and because the categories themselves have changed. So we are left with a king who can be studied, interpreted, and argued over, but not fully recovered from the past. The mystery is not an empty gap. It is a reminder of the limits of hindsight. We can look back with better medicine than his doctors had. We can reject the cruelty of old labels. We can compare symptoms and question theories. But we should also admit that the man himself remains partly beyond reach. Not because he was a king, because he was a patient whose suffering was turned into politics before anyone truly understood it. Chapter 14. Blindness, Grief, and Final Isolation. In the last years of George III's life, the drama of his reign became quieter, but not gentler. The earlier crises had been full of movement. Doctors summoned, ministers alarmed, Parliament debating, the Prince of Wales waiting, the public watching for signs of recovery. But the final decline had a different texture. It was slower, heavier, less like a storm breaking over the palace, and more like the gradual closing of doors. By then, the king who had once tried to embody vigilance and control was losing his ability to command even the ordinary boundaries of his world. His sight failed. His hearing weakened. His mind, already marked by recurring illness, moved further beyond reliable contact. The man who had spent so many years reading papers, questioning ministers, inspecting details, and insisting on duty was increasingly cut off from the instruments through which he had known himself as king. Blindness carries a symbolic weight in any ruler's story, sometimes too much. It is easy to make it into a theatrical image, the king who could no longer see the kingdom. But we should be careful. George's blindness was not a metaphor invented for historians. It was a physical reality. One more form of deprivation layered onto illness, age, and grief. And grief came heavily. In 1810, his beloved youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, died. George had been deeply attached to her, and her death appears to have struck him with devastating force. For a father already vulnerable, already worn by years of strain and recurring disorder, the loss was not simply another sorrow in a long royal calendar of births, marriages, and funerals. It was intimate. Royal grief is often dressed for public view. This one seems to have gone inward. Soon after, the king's condition deteriorated so severely that the old question could no longer be delayed in the same way. Britain had faced the possibility of regency before. This time, the arrangement became unavoidable. In 1811, the Prince of Wales formally became Prince Regent, exercising royal authority while his father remained alive. The son had reached power at last, but not through triumph. Not really. He ruled in the place of a father who had not died, but had receded. That distinction gave the regency its melancholy foundation. The old king was still present in law, in name, in memory, and in the emotional imagination of the country. Yet the practical work of sovereignty had moved elsewhere. George III became a living absence. This is the phrase that best captures his final years. He was not erased. His reign continued. Documents still bore the reality of his kingship in a formal sense. The monarchy still derived continuity from him, but the active, disciplined, sometimes stubborn mind that had once fought to shape government was no longer directing the realm. For a man like George, that loss is difficult to overstate. He had not been a monarch, content to dissolve into ceremony. From youth, He had believed that kingship demanded effort. He read, decided, resisted, judged, worried, and intervened. Whether one admires or criticizes his politics, his idea of himself was bound to active duty. To be removed from power while still alive was therefore not merely a constitutional development. It was a personal unmaking. And yet, by this stage, it is uncertain how fully he understood the nature of what had been taken from him. That uncertainty is part of the sadness. If he did not fully grasp it, then the old king had lost even the ability to comprehend his own displacement. If he did grasp it in moments, then those moments must have been cruel. The Regency also changed the emotional architecture of the monarchy. For decades, George III had been the father figure at the center of the royal family and, symbolically, of the nation. Now the father remained, but authority had passed to the son. The family drama that had once hovered around the sick room became the structure of government itself. The Prince of Wales no longer merely waited in the wings. He stood in the light, while his father faded behind him. This was not simply a change of personnel. It was another step in the long separation between the person of the monarch and the institution of the crown. The state continued. Ministers acted. Wars were fought. Policies were made. Ceremonies proceeded. The monarchy did not require George's active reason to survive. That fact, once terrifying, became daily reality. There is a cold comfort in that. Institutions survive by learning not to depend too much on any single human being. But monarchy, especially in its older emotional form, depends on the belief that a particular human being matters profoundly. George's final years forced Britain to hold both truths at once. The king mattered. The king was no longer necessary in the way he had once believed. In Windsor, he lived increasingly apart from the political world that had defined him. Accounts of his final isolation often emphasize the pathos. An aged, blind, mentally afflicted king, wandering through fragments of memory and devotion, separated from public life while the kingdom moved on in his name. We should not polish that into legend too neatly. The evidence can be filtered through sentiment, and later retellings often prefer the image of a tragic old monarch because tragedy gives shape to discomfort. Still, the broad reality is hard to soften. George III ended his reign not in the full possession of royal command, but in dependency. He had survived rebellion, war, faction, humiliation, recovery, relapse, and political transformation. Yet his last enemy was not Parliament, France, America, or his son's ambition. It was the closing world of his own body and mind. The irony is almost too severe. A king devoted to order ended in confusion. A ruler committed to sight, scrutiny, and detail ended in blindness. A father of the nation ended increasingly unreachable by his own family and subjects. A monarch who believed deeply in sacred duty became a symbol of the crown's ability to continue without the person who wore it. And yet, there is a danger in letting the irony become the whole man. George's final isolation should not make us forget the decades before it. He was not only the old blind king of Windsor. He had been young, earnest, ambitious, difficult, conscientious, flawed, devout, politically active, and emotionally attached to the role he believed Providence had placed upon him. His end is moving precisely because so much identity had to be stripped away before history was finished with him. By the time he died in 1820, George III had become a figure both present and distant. remembered by some with loyalty, by others with criticism, by later generations through the simplified shadow of madness. But in those final years, beyond the arguments and diagnoses, there remains something simpler. A man who had once carried a kingdom in his daily thoughts found himself carried by others, and the crown, which he had tried so hard to steady, had already learned to stand without him. Chapter 15. The crown learns to survive without the king. By the time George III was finally removed from real power under the Regency, Britain had already crossed a threshold. It had not crossed it with a clean declaration. There was no single moment when the old monarchy ended and the modern monarchy began. History rarely does us that favor. More often, institutions change while pretending they are only preserving themselves. That is what happened here. George III's incapacity forced Britain to make a distinction that had always been present in theory, but was now unavoidable in practice. The king was not the same thing as the crown. The difference sounds simple. It was not. For centuries, monarchy had depended on a powerful fusion of person and office. The sovereign's body carried meaning. His presence mattered. His words, signatures, judgments, and rituals were treated as expressions of authority. The crown was not just an institution floating above the human being. It was embodied in him. George's illness disturbed that embodiment. He was still king. He had not abdicated. He had not been overthrown. He had not died. And yet the essential work of monarchy had to be performed without his active participation. Ministers needed authority. Parliament needed continuity. The empire needed decisions. The law needed a functioning head of state. The country could not wait forever at the door of the royal sick room. So the Constitution adapted. The Regency allowed the Prince of Wales to exercise royal authority while George remained sovereign in name. This arrangement was not merely a family solution. It was an institutional lesson. It showed that the powers of monarchy could be separated from the monarch's personal capacity, reassigned temporarily, and still appear legitimate. That was the remarkable thing. Britain did not cease to be a monarchy because the king could not rule. It became a monarchy capable of surviving the king's inability to rule. This may sound cold, but it was also necessary. A state that depends entirely on the uninterrupted health of one person is not stable. George's illness made that truth impossible to ignore. The British Constitution had to protect continuity not only from invasion, rebellion, and disputed succession, but from frailty, from age, from grief, from blindness, from mental illness, from the ordinary vulnerabilities of a human body. The crisis did not produce a modern ceremonial monarchy overnight. The Prince Regent himself was hardly a symbol of modest constitutional restraint. Political influence, personal preference, patronage, and court maneuvering did not vanish, but the deeper movement was clear enough. The sovereign's personal will could no longer be treated as the sole living center of government. The office had begun to outgrow the man. There is a paradox here. George III had spent much of his reign trying to restore the active moral authority of the crown. He wanted the monarch to matter. He resisted the idea that kingship should be captured by factions or reduced to ornament. In his mind, the king's conscience and judgment were essential parts of national life. Yet his own suffering helped push the monarchy in the opposite direction. Not because he failed morally, not because his enemies defeated him in some final ideological battle, but because his incapacity revealed the danger of tying the state too tightly to the sovereign's personal functioning. The system could respect him, mourn him, pray for him, and continue in his name, while also learning to operate without him. That lesson would become one of the foundations of later constitutional monarchy. The monarch could remain symbolically central while being politically limited. The crown could offer continuity, identity, ritual, and legitimacy, while day-to-day government depended increasingly on ministers responsible to Parliament. The king or queen might still matter deeply, but the state would not collapse when the sovereign became ill, old, unpopular, distracted, or personally incapable. George's tragedy helped clarify this separation. And the clarification mattered because monarchy survives by managing contradiction. It must appear timeless while constantly adjusting. It must honor bloodline while obeying law. It must elevate a person while protecting the institution from that person's weaknesses. It must make one family seem essential while ensuring the nation can function when members of that family cannot. George III made that contradiction visible. His illness forced politicians, physicians, courtiers, and the public to confront the uncomfortable fact that reverence is not a system of government. Reverence can steady a nation emotionally, but it cannot sign documents, appoint ministers, manage war, or resolve legal uncertainty when the sovereign is unreachable. For that, procedures are needed. And procedures are rarely romantic. They are committees, bills, restrictions, oaths, debates, precedents, carefully worded limitations, and all the dry machinery that keeps a country moving when its symbols tremble. The Regency Crisis and its eventual resolution showed that constitutional monarchy would survive not by denying the king's humanity, but by building around it. There is something almost humane in that, though it may not have felt humane to George. To separate the crown from the king was to protect the state. It was also, in a strange way, to admit the truth of his suffering. He was not a sacred mechanism. He was a man. His mind could fail. His senses could fail. His strength could fail. The institution that had dressed him in ceremony had to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that ceremony could not make him invulnerable. This is why George III's incapacity belongs not only to medical history, but to constitutional history. His illness changed the imagination of power. It encouraged Britain to see monarchy less as the personal command of a sovereign and more as a continuous office supported by law, parliament, ministry, and public consent. The crown could still be revered, but it had become more clearly separable from the private condition of the person wearing it. That separation did not remove the sadness. If anything, it deepened it, because the more successfully the crown survived without George, the more isolated George himself became from the thing he had served. The institution endured by moving past him while still using his name. The kingdom remained loyal to the king in language, even as it learned not to need him in practice. For a monarch devoted to duty, that may be the loneliest fate imaginable. Not deposition, not execution, not defeat in battle. Continuation. The world he had tried to guide kept going, carefully, legally, respectfully, and increasingly without him. George III's incapacity did not destroy the British monarchy. It helped teach it how to endure the frailty of monarchs. It exposed the weakness of personal kingship and strengthened the logic of institutional monarchy. The crown survived, but it survived by learning one of the hardest lessons any monarchy can learn: that the person at its center must never be allowed to be its only support. Chapter 16. The madness that refused to disappear. George III's illness never truly left British history. It outlived the doctors who treated him, the ministers who debated him, the son who replaced him in practice, and the political emergencies that once made every report from the sick room feel urgent. Long after the palace doors closed behind the final years, the story remained. A king still crowned, still alive, yet gradually unreachable. That is why the phrase, "mad king," has endured, even though it is too small for the man. It is memorable. It is cruel. It offers a shortcut through a life that deserves more than a shortcut. George III was not only the monarch who lost the American colonies. He was not only the ruler whose illness shook Parliament. He was not only the old blind figure of Windsor, separated from power while the Regency governed in his name. He was all of these things, and more difficult than all of them. He was a king who tried to make monarchy moral and discovered that virtue could not protect him from political failure. He was a father whose family became a constitutional mechanism. He was a sovereign whose private suffering became public evidence. He was a patient treated by men who wanted to heal him, control him, and interpret him, often at the same time. The mystery of his illness survived partly because the evidence never settled into certainty. Porphyria, bipolar disorder, another condition, or some combination now beyond recovery. Each theory tells us something, but none restores the whole man. The records are too partial. The language of the time is too distant. The observers were too entangled in fear, loyalty, ambition, and medical uncertainty. But the mystery also survived because it touched something larger than diagnosis. George III exposed the hidden vulnerability inside monarchy itself. A crown can look eternal from a distance. It can gather ritual, law, memory, and national feeling around it until it seems almost immune to ordinary human weakness. But monarchy always rests, at least in part, on a body. A breathing person. A mind that must wake, listen, decide, remember, and endure. George's illness made that fact impossible to ignore. Britain did not collapse when he became incapacitated. That was the lesson. The crown learned to survive without the king's active mind. The institution separated itself from the man, not cleanly, not kindly, but effectively. And in that separation, a path opened toward the more modern idea of monarchy. Symbolic, continuous, legally managed, less dependent on personal command. Yet something was lost in that survival. The more the crown endured, the more visible George's isolation became. The system protected itself by moving around him. His name remained powerful while his own voice faded from government. He became, in the final act, both central and absent. The king in whose reign events continued, but not the king who could shape them. That is the haunting contradiction. George III's suffering strengthened the monarchy by proving it could live beyond the functioning mind of its sovereign. But for George himself, that achievement looked like disappearance. History often prefers rulers in clear categories: tyrant, reformer, fool, hero, failure. George resists that simplicity. He was stubborn and dutiful, limited and sincere, politically consequential and personally vulnerable. His reign held empire and loss, domestic virtue and family pain, constitutional development, and medical confusion. Perhaps that is why he remains with us. Not because the mystery can be solved neatly, but because it cannot. Not because madness made him monstrous, but because illness made him unmistakably human, in an office designed to conceal humanity beneath ceremony. In the end, George III did not vanish from history. He vanished slowly from reach, and somewhere in that distance, between the man, the monarch, and the legend, the story still waits, asking us to look again.